Haha, we are live on a Wednesday. This is not a normal Rebel Roundtable. This is an offshoot of fun that I like to do because, when something comes up over and over and over again, you're like, I really should write an article about that. I really should talk about that. And that's happened the last few weeks. And Belle is the one I always text and say, guess what? It happened again, or I have an idea. So Belle and I decided to do this live stream today to talk about why copying and pasting a workflow from another system or software or a law firm may not be the quick fix that you think it's going to be, and who you're going to blame then when it does happen, when it doesn't work like you think it's going to. So, thank you for humoring me, Belle. I appreciate it.
I'm delighted to be here. And how much did it hurt you to say may not be as opposed to definitely will not be?
It hurt a lot. I'm trying to practice like diplomacy and I'm not really good at it. So that's one of those things. But this does keep coming up. And I know you see this with your process mapping, and I see it from the strategic side of things, trying to get people to do the process mapping and map things out. But what is like, what's a trap? Like, why is this? I keep joking. It's a trap. It's a trap. Channeling my Star Wars nerdiness.
Yeah.
But why is it such an attractive trap, I guess?
I mean, there's two questions there, and I'm gonna to speak to both of them. I would say why it's attractive is, I think, fairly self-evident. People think, oh, this is a solved problem. I can take that, I can use the solution, and then I don't have to solve the problem again. And when I phrase it that way, doesn't that seem pretty reasonable, right? Like, why reinvent the wheel? Why create it over again? And now that I've decided to say reinvent the wheel, did you ever go or see one of those like science museum displays where it has a bumpy track and then a car with triangle or square
Yes.
wheels?
Yes.
It's reminding me of those, right? You don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel, but you need to make sure that your wheel matches your road. So
Yep.
if you're just driving along the same highway as everyone else, the same tires are probably going to work. That's not actually what tends to be happening. In a law firm, what practice management tool you're using, the way that you've distributed the roles and responsibilities, the expectations you've set around follow up, all of these pieces feed into what your process needs to do, when it needs to do it, how it needs to do it. Chances are real good it's just not that perfect a match for what someone else is doing.
And it's a good thing it's not a match, because that's actually what makes firms like their unique selling proposition, all those things. And if you just copy paste someone else, I mean, what are you selling on then? Oh, I have that problem. um, so why does it, so when you see this, because I know you see this a lot, what backfires? Like, what are the results that you see when someone does this?
Yeah, the I would say two most common issues, ways it backfires. One, something that's really important to that firm just doesn't happen anymore because it wasn't important to whoever created the workflow, so it's just not there. And I'm not talking about things where you're making adjustments, right? If there's a step in the process to reach out to the client and update them every other week and you want to do it every week or once a month, that is pretty easy to adjust. Most people do that. It's still kind of part of the copy paste. What I'm talking about is you brought in a workflow that doesn't actually have a proactive reach out step for updating clients. And your team knows that's how you used to do things, but you just gave them a new process. It doesn't have that step. So they go, okay, let's follow the process.
Not following up anymore.
Yep.
Woohoo.
Alternatively, you end up with whole new steps that have no value or meaning for your practice. So, for example, if you have a completely different file management system in place, maybe you've really streamlined where you're putting information, how it's stored, and you happen to copy paste a process from somebody who's got a solid process, but still working on some of that back end infrastructure, there may be steps in there that are telling you to send information and store it and print it. And now your team says, okay. as instructed, I will store the information. I will email it over here. I will print it out.
I will create a PDF and I will scan it and shred
Yeah.
it and do all kinds of crazy things. Yeah.
Great use of time. But it really is that at heart, different firms have different priorities and different ways of communicating, different expectations. So when you copy paste, you get a process that is really great for someone else's priorities.
Mhm. And I think from what I've seen, the disconnect comes from that there's some new technology, there's something that someone is willing to try, which is great. I love it when a firm is actually willing to try something new, but
Yeah.
then they get discouraged because they try it and it doesn't work the way they thought it would because they overlaid it on top of either bad processes or that's not how they've traditionally worked with their clients, that kind of thing. And so then the technology gets blamed, the software gets blamed, their staff gets blamed. And my article basically says, actually, you are the problem. The owner of the firm is the problem because you are band-aiding and duct taping. I use duct tape a lot. Um, Trying to find an easy fix for a not so easy problem, I guess, is how I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm working with organizations trying to do, to understand what the future process should be, I always look at what the current process is, not because it is inherently awesome, like sometimes yes, often no. However, what I do want to be able to do is look at each of those steps and say, hey, you are emailing this and you're saving it in this shared file. Why is that? Is there a reason you need to do that? And in most cases, the answer is going to be no, we don't need to do that. And there may be some, discovery requirements where your retention policies are set differently in the email and the storage, and you have to have it in both places, for some sort of compliance piece, right? I'm making that up, but there are times where the rest of the world forces potentially non-ideal constraints on you, and you need to make sure that, if that's the case, you really do need to be following them. So I want to understand, what are you currently doing, and of course also then look at things where maybe you are doing both, but let's have a conversation around which one is more valuable, right? Should
Right.
it only go in the shared file? Should it only go in the email? Again, depending on the context, one answer may be better than the other, and it's hard to have that conversation or take 8 steps back and realize that document didn't even need to be created at all if you don't have the full end to end already in place.
Yeah. I think that's hard. I think the hard part about this is that it does take some like reflection and sitting down and looking at things. And lawyers are really busy and they're going to say, well, we don't have time for all this nonsense. Just do it the way we've always done it and do as you're told. And I think there's an argument to be made that the lack of efficiency that comes from just band-aiding all this together is impacting their bottom line. It's impacting their saleability of their law firm because you can't sell broken trash.
Mm-hmm.
I have better words for that, but you can't sell something that's broken. And I just don't, I understand the time. I understand it does take time. I think, please verify this, it also often takes someone outside looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, exactly to your point, lawyers are already busy, and honestly, their staff is often usually already busy. This is where the whole conversation around perspective being an attribute all its own comes into play, and priorities, right? If you bring in an outside person, that outside person has one job, and it's to make sure that your processes are sorted. Your team has a lot of jobs, and most of them have to center around serving your clients. And so that perspective, or responsibility and prioritization, helps keep the ball rolling. And the perspective really is valuable,
Mhm.
because it's easy to locally optimize, right? The examples I've been giving tend to talk about what happens in this one step, but that's just a small piece of the puzzle. I will say transparently, there are plenty of times where I make a part of a process way less efficient because if you take a little more time up here, you save a ton of time down here. And
Yeah,
you
it's
can't,
not always one for one.
right. And so you can have people in your practice whose job is, is to see that big picture, to know what everyone downstream is doing and how the information is being used, but that's not common, that's not typical. And so if someone has to learn it, you may as well let someone else spend their time learning it while your team actually serves clients, gets work done.
And I think some of that comes back to if we start to get into like organizational functioning, which is Belle's area of expertise, um, listening to the people who are actually doing the work is really hard for lawyers, is what I
Really
found.
hard for a lot of people.
Okay, so it's not just, so I'm not just going to pick on lawyers, but
Yeah.
yes,
Well,
let's talk
and
about that a little bit. Yeah.
it's because of that shift in perspective, right? Because in different insights weigh on us and stick with us. And it's really easy when you're talking to someone and they say, I could be so much faster if I just didn't do this one thing, because they don't realize that that one thing that they're doing enables four different processes that other people are doing. They don't see how that work product is used. And the first time they come to you and say, I don't want to do this, it's really easy to immediately decide, oh, well, no one understands how this firm works. I'm the only one who sees it, and then start discounting other
Yeah.
suggestions. And it blinds us, right? You have to be really aware and cognizant of the fact that you probably need to hear 10 or 15 ideas to get three or four good ones. But man, those three or four good ones can make a big difference.
And I think it's easy to pinpoint someone who's trying to make changes or trying to suggest things as the problem
Mm-hmm.
when if and I got that reputation when I was at a corporate environment 25 years ago. I was the problem child
Can't
because I was,
imagine
why do we do things this way? Why can't we make this more efficient? And it was actually very efficient. Looking back, how crazy efficient it was. But you
it.
have that reputation then of being the problem child or the problem, like, oh, she's always complaining. And I'm like, no, I'm trying to bring in ideas, but it's not always appreciated. So
Well, and when you have someone like that, it's also easy to get frustrated and say, because again, the first couple ideas, especially if it's somebody newer to your firm or newer to their job in general, they just don't have the perspective, right? They may have a lot of energy and enthusiasm and great ideas for this zone, and it can be exhausting to try and help them expand that view to see the bigger picture. But man, the rewards are really worth it. Once they've got that perspective, they can bring a lot to the table.
and that's come up a couple times in recent presentations I've done where someone's asked, how do I'm, been practicing for 20, 30 years. How do I get my mind to switch that mindset that needs to switch to almost the curiosity from that's how it's always been done. And that's our culture, especially in North Dakota. I've seen this where that's just how it's always been done. And I didn't have a good answer when someone asked me this recently, other than hang out with people who are you want to be like and not listening to the naysayers is kind of like the first step, because I think we get in that echo chamber sometimes of we're all going to do this. But any tips there?
Well, I think that again comes back to where those external resources can be really valuable. Someone who's seen other ways of doing it, and also seeing what mistakes other people make. I mean, that circling back a little bit to the, how is this such a beautiful trap? There's also a big assumption in copy pasting in other firms' processes that the process really is working well for them. Do you
Interesting.
know that that process is actually efficient and actually serving the organization that's using it? Even that can be, I think everyone's had that experience of, the kind of the swan above the water and then the feet scrambling underneath. Be careful what
Yes.
you copy.
Is everything on the outside is as cool as everything, or everything on the inside is cool and complete as the outside. I think that's, you never know what's going on.
It,
And then
which
also,
also, I
yeah,
was gonna say, is not a full answer to your question, because
no.
there isn't necessarily, I think, an easy answer to how do you break out of the this is how it's always been done. Otherwise, more people would do it.
Well, and I think, and that's why I was coming down with if you the ones I hear from that eventually do come around, it's like, well, I was just living in this world of people around me saying it wasn't possible. And as soon as I talked to you, you made it seem at least like it was possible. And just having someone that will tell you, okay, you may be crazy, but let's try to do crazy ones, um, can go a long way. And so I think that people often just want that encouragement that they're not crazy and they're thinking about things differently. So that was like where I first came from. There's some good books out there, there's some good tools, but it's not like it's a magic pill that you can just take and wake up with an open mind.
Or
Otherwise,
imagine, yeah, I imagine that's also an area where some of the obsequiousness that's been creeping into the chat, LLM
yeah,
tools might actually serve you really well.
yep,
Going in and saying, "Hey, this is my idea." The default response is going to be, "Great idea," and
right. It wants to make you happy. I keep joking about AI wanting to make you happy. That's its whole goal, is to make you happy. And so AI and Chat GPT and Claude, all of them are great brainstorming tools too. It's not going to tell you that's a horrible idea, but you can tell it to do research for you. You can do all kinds of things. So yes, I would prefer to talk to chat most days, than other people. Oops, I'm not supposed to say that out loud. That's not, you didn't hear that.
but
Um,
but that is part of where I think you bring so much to the table because you love the wild, out of the box ideas and being able to offer that encouragement. They don't all work,
no.
right? And you don't know most of them do. So you might as well pursue it and see, what other great ideas it can lead to.
Well, and I think that's part of it too, is having that is tends to be my superpower, is all these ideas, but then also I'm really good at telling people, like, here's what I see and prioritizing, whereas sometimes it's just fully, I'm not great at that for myself. I will be fully transparent, but I'm really good at doing for other people. It worked in bankruptcy for me well. It works in working with law firms. It works in legal aid, because it's just one of those things where you're able to focus in on, hey, this sounds like a great idea, let's go down that path, instead of that's crazy. Too crazy for me is usually a warning sign. So,
Fair.
but having someone like to bounce ideas off of and be able to, like, lawyers need to be open to the idea that there is a different way of doing things. And I think that's where we get hung up on. So,
Yeah.
um, something that has come up recently was like copying workflows from software to another to try to use. And I think in this particular instance, it was like a 4-year-old workflow. And I was like, that software has changed a lot since that workflow was developed. And I was
Hmm.
just like cringing, as my kids would say, Mom, that's cringe, um, at the idea of copying a 4-year-old workflow into a software that's completely adapted and changed over 4 years. So have you seen people trying to do things like that?
Yeah, so the same firm, it was their own workflow, but moving it into.
No, it was another firm's.
Oh, okay.
It was another firm's workflow that they wanted to
Oh,
copy.
but one of those, this worked in Clio for this firm, so
Yeah,
it should work in
exactly.
Clio for me. Yeah.
Yep.
Whew, yeah, that gets tricky because then you end up with one, yes, the tool may be different, it is different. Two, now you're getting this is how it's always been done. Someone else's this is how it's always been done. So there's a lot of traps there. I will say I haven't run into that a ton, mostly because the people I see trying to copy paste are trying to chase the new shiny, but
Yep.
as
Yep.
quickly as possible. So it
It's
doesn't
that
tend
too.
to be the for, but whew, yeah, I can see a lot of ways in which that could go sideways because even just looking at what was happening 4 years ago, there were a lot of resources that are available, were not available then that are available now that would probably inform
Yeah.
a new workflow.
So one thing I'm always trying to figure out, and maybe you're a good person to answer this, is, or at least have some ideas. Other than bringing in someone outside to look at things, are there any like red flags that you can point out that, like, oh, maybe I do have a workflow problem, or maybe I have a structure problem? Like, how does this manifest itself, I guess?
Yeah, I'll start with the structure side versus, and then
Yeah.
then talk about the workflow side because I think the structure side, the way I see it come up most often is when people are saying, I love my team. I think the world of them. They are awesome. And I'm just really struggling to hold them accountable.
Yeah.
Because when you know that you've got great, competent, well-intentioned, dedicated folks and you're still feeling that gap and you're not sure why, that's probably a structural issue. Some misunderstandings around who actually owns what, who's supposed to be doing what, when. And most often, speaking of that 4-year-old workflow, that's what I tend to see. It's that it's an old understanding that has evolved and sort of evolved in slowly different directions that are now pretty divergent. And so the same can be true on the workflow side. Knowing that you have a workflow problem, I would say when you start seeing folks asking the same questions over and over and over again, where is this discovery? Where is this brief? Where is this? When will I have that? When will I have this? Who's doing this? Who's doing that? It's the same question over and over. That's almost certainly a process
Okay.
issue.
Okay. It's interesting that you say that too, because one thing I had identified recently on something I was reviewing and looking at and trying to figure out was I was reviewing client reviews, and that those things came up, like it took too long or deadlines weren't met or we didn't expect the bill that we received. And I was like, oh, these are things that between marketing and messaging and
Mm-hmm.
process, there are probably some very big gaps in their systems. So that's what I've been seeing lately too. So, because I don't like to just go on and on about problems. Before someone starts jumping into like new technology or importing another business's workflow, where do they start? Like what should they do first?
I would say the first thing is to let me back up a second. Is this somebody who is excited about doing something new, or is this somebody who is convinced that they need to, but not pumped?
I would say they're frustrated but they're open-minded to figuring out a better way, because that's often what I see is frustration. It's just pure frustration.
Yeah, so for those folks, I would recommend starting by describing the outcome, not the process, but the
Mm-hmm.
outcome, right? So my team knows who's doing these things that are most important to me. We have figured out how to not drop the ball over here. We're using our new software really well, right? Finding those descriptors first to
Mm-hmm.
get excited about where you're trying to go and what those frustrations you're trying to solve are, and then jump back to documenting what you're currently doing.
Yeah.
If you're already super excited about the future state, go back and start with where you are now so that you don't miss any of those things. Because the other trap I see folks fall into is they go right to the new version, copy pasting someone else's or making up their own, but they don't go back to double check what is currently happening. And the thing about starting with the new version is people do get excited. They start implementing. They will start to run with it. Your team will come with you. It's awesome. And if you haven't checked the current state first, it's easy for those things to get dropped before you go back to look at them.
And I think that's important too, like what you said, not copy pasting the old into the new technology. I've made that mistake. And it wasn't actually, it worked out the way it should have because of some change management that we need to have happen. But if you're going to adopt a new technology, step back, like Belle says, take a look at what the outcome you want and where the efficiencies are. And it may very well be that your current system would work in the new system with a few tweaks here or there. But it also may be that you don't need to download a document, edit it, save it, upload a document, save it here, email it there in the new system. And so I think that working back from the outcome is a good way. My other one that I wish people would look at more is the client's experience, like looking at how the client experiences your firm is often a workflow problem, and
Yep.
identifying what the client experiences when they call, set up an appointment, sign a retainer is really eye-opening, I will say, when I start working with firms. They don't realize that, oh, this link doesn't work in their retainer. I've made it so difficult for them to pay me that no one pays me type thing.
Well, and just to build on that, the one of the biggest complaints that I hear from lawyers is people call and disrupt me. And so if you want to if you want to minimize that, making building into your process those touch points, right? This is one of those seems less efficient actually is more efficient if you have fixed communication points that are proactive enough that your clients feel satisfied, in the loop, happy. Yes, your team has to do that communication. You may have to do that communication, but you get to do it on your terms as opposed to that surprise disruption that can have a hugely outsized impact. So that's a great example of places where you can
I mean, we hit on all my pet peeves is I don't take unscheduled phone calls and don't, guard your time and set those boundaries. But you can't do that unless you have an idea of what you want your firm to look like. And some of the way this all comes up is you can say, oh, I'm an estate planning attorney. I'm a bankruptcy attorney. That's not why clients call you. Clients call you because of how your firm works and how you operate and what your brand is out there. And a lot of that is built on what Belle does with the dysfunction and creating function out of that from an organizational standpoint. And then the processes that you've created and message to the world that this is how your firm works. And so a lot of people, I know they poo poo all my ideas, but you're not selling an estate plan. You're selling the experience of getting the estate plan. So,
well, this is why we partner so well together, right? That you are so well suited to helping these lawyers and leaders articulate what they want, like those wild and crazy visions of being excited to check in and make sure the plan is still up to date.
yeah.
That's your, and then once you've got that vision, I can come in and say, all right, here's some details that actually make it happen.
Bella asks great questions too. I love it when she's like, well, why do you do that? That's like my favorite question is, well, why? Why do we do that? And it makes it, and you feel almost defensive sometimes. You're like, well, but that's how it's always been done. And then you know that it's probably going to change because if that's what your answer is, then there's probably not a good reason for it.
I do have gentler phrasing coming way back to what you said about being, but I know you're going to respond well to that one.
Yes. So I will say my personal experience working with Belle in my previous law firm and things like that, we know each other well. But it's very true that I am much more the strategic, like, where do you want to be type discussion. And Belle is much more the dig into what you're currently doing and make recommendations for getting there. So we do partner well together for that reason.
And one recommendation we both give, do not copy paste someone else's workflow.
It's a trap.
It's a trap.
It's a trap. Keep pasting this. Any last words of wisdom, Belle?
I think I snuck him in before you asked.
Got them all. Okay.
Yep.
I know. I was trying to, we're all like running around and doing things. And I appreciate that I texted her crazily enough, like on a middle of the night probably, and said, hey, let's do a live stream on Wednesday afternoon. And she's like, that sounds like fun. So I appreciate it. I can just pontificate for half an hour. So
always a joy. Thank you so much, Jen. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you. And I will put Belle's contact information in the description of the live stream so that everyone can find her, or LinkedIn. Belle Walker on LinkedIn too. So reach out to her. She's amazing. And reach out to me if you want someone to tell you, yes, you can do it. Because that's my job.